Tracey, thank you for coming by. This is going to be a casual conversation. Okay. We call it the Woven Fireside Chat.
I like that.
We're by the fireside.
FDR and all that.
Exactly, that's great. Well, just, by way of introduction, when we first started working in the realm of archiving, when we started to build this, and actually some archivists found us because they had heard about what we were doing with the New York Times and some other things. Actually, your name always came up, and people always kind of talk, always good things, and so it was pretty awesome to meet in India when we first met, and then really to get a chance to collaborate together on the Levi's Vault. So really excited to have you here, and
thank you. We love it. We're excited.
Awesome, that's great, and really again, this will be a casual chat that we'll just talk. Focus will be around learning more about you and your career through archiving, and also just where some of the trends are that you're seeing, and then as we've been starting to work with more archivists, how they should be thinking around the nature of going into kind of a digital world too, and then also thinking about the storytelling around pieces and how those things can have a huge impact on their organizations or their customers and so forth. So yeah, maybe we could just start with a little bit of background. How did you get to your current role at Levi's? What twists or turns or maybe straight paths just got you there, and would love to hear more about what inspired that journey to get to where you are now.
Well, going way back, I've always been interested in stories. My mother is from New Zealand, so our family roots are so we've got some rich cultural roots. We are Maori, so the indigenous people of New Zealand, and historically the Maori did not have a written language. They were always an oral tradition. So oral tradition in culturally has been an important part of my growing up. I remember my grandfather when he immigrated to the United States, and if you were there's an artifact, it's called a toko toko, which they call a talking stick. And if you are speaking at some kind of a Maori function, you hold the toko toko. And I remember my grandfather doing that and accenting words that he used with his stick. My son now has one of those because he's the eldest, has become the speaker for our family. I mention that because those roots, I think, run deeper. I appreciate them more than I did growing up, but my mother would always tell stories about her life in New Zealand, and I was always interested in stories. I think that led me to go into history as a major. So I studied history as an undergrad at Cal, and then when I went to get my master's and got a degree in history, and always seeking out stories as I did that, and when I finished, I took a little small stint to law school. Didn't work for me, but decided that I wanted to do something related to history, but making it very relevant. So got a degree in history, public history, and rather than teach, I went into business archives. And I saw speaking the archivist for Hewlett-Packard. And she'd come from an academic background working at Harvard, and then came out to Silicon Valley and helped build their collection. I saw her speaking. She was so inspiring to me. I was like, I'm going to do that. And that was when I was getting my master's. So when I graduated, I knew that's the direction I wanted to go into. And also, I had interned. I wanted to get a taste of what other things were like. I'd interned at the California State Archives, which has a fabulous collection. But it would have left me doing one or two different things, like you can process and organize a collection. Right. You can do reference. It was like, no, I want to do a lot of different things, which is part of what I love about my job. I wear a lot of different hats. I work in a lot of different areas. And so when I graduated, I've always been in business and corporate archives. And I started in cell phones, so I worked at a company in San Francisco that launched cellular service in the LA Olympics in '84. And from there, so I went from cell phones to cars. I worked for AAA for a while, and they helped to to introduce cars when horseback riding and wagons and streetcars were really the thing of the day. I was there for 14 years, and then been at Levi Strauss for 5.
Wow.
But always in San Francisco. There are a lot of intersections with all of those companies, the same milestones that, the San Francisco earthquake affected all of those businesses. So a lot of similarities, but it's really fun to be at a place that provides clothes because they're so versatile.
Well, I was going to ask, what excited you about the Levi's opportunity in particular, and do you think there was something in mind that they had, like why this was so important to them? And
well, the Levi's brand has been something I wore started with 501s when I was in high school in the 80s. And grew up in Salt Lake, surrounded by mountains. So we were in the West, and I had 3 sisters and many girlfriends, and we all wanted 501s. They had just come out with them for women in the 80s, and you would buy them shrink to fit. So they were a little bigger, and then you had to wash them a couple times, and then they would fit you just right. But they were like the thing to have, and so that really was my first. Well, it kicked off my passion for Levi's, so I've been wearing them ever since. And when this position opened up, it was the perfect combination of exploring history. It was related to San Francisco. It was a long-time brand, and I knew it. And it was much more personal than the other businesses that I had been in, the products that they make.
That's great.
Because most people have a Levi story.
That's great. And did they have a sense of the role that they wanted you to play there, or was it kind of open-ended and said like, hey, we've got this rich history, shape it? Like what was that kind of, I guess, what was that journey like when you got into that front door in Levi's Plaza?
My predecessor was there for almost 25 years.
Wow.
Lynn Downey, who was the first historian hired by Bob Haas, the great-great-grandnephew of Levi Strauss. She began the collection and did a great job of building what is mainly a garment collection, other things too, but she became a great, she always has been a great storyteller, but what she did really was become a voice for business archives in many ways, because she would be featured in the newspaper. I'd see her very enviously. She'd be in the paper, she'd be flying off to Japan, picking up things, or going around the world. So she did a great job of building the archives. What she decided to retire, and what they were looking for at Levi Strauss was somebody who could bring the collection into the 21st century. It was very manual. And what I mean by that is they tracked this fabulous collection in a group of binders, handwritten in some cases, on the shelf. And it's a global company, Levi Strauss is, and we needed to bring, move into an age where the collection could be accessed by people all over the world. So after my first 6 months there, that was my main focus, and we launched our first digital tool within a year of my being there.
Wow. How is this digital transformation changing the archive space, changing the history space that you're seeing? From one, just what are some of those basics that everyone kind of needs to do, but then what are some of the maybe things that you're getting excited about in terms of adding the digital layer into the historian's role and the archivist's role?
Well, to start with, the collection is now available to everyone, anywhere in the world. And we have operations in Europe, in Asia, South America, and you can literally go onto our tool. So we have, it's called the Virtual Vault. We have the Vault Museum, and we have the Virtual Vault, which is our digital tool. And you can see all of the garments that are on site have been photographed. You can see most of our important documents, and literally get a sense of what we have if you were to come in person. And it's also made it much easier for me to do my job. I'm the media spokesperson for Heritage at the company, and I just got back recently from Shanghai it was a very quick turnaround trip. I was asked if I could assist them with something about 3 weeks before they needed me there. And what allowed me to be able to figure out what we could do was sharing digitally what I could bring to the Chinese market. I took 6 pieces with me, and 6 pieces with great stories. So I was able to take them, we put them on display. I did a lot of storytelling, which we filmed as part of this event, and really something you probably couldn't have done without those tools in place.
That's great. And you touched on stories. Why have stories and insight been so important to your role there? Like, well, are there some examples too where the stories really brought a piece of physical history to life and maybe made an impact?
The stories, right, stories bring things to life. They give the context for how our products were used, and they really add the emotional connection and the personal connection to people. So I just had, before coming here, I just had a group of professional bull riders, rodeo bull riders.
Nice.
And when folks like this come into the archives and you show them things, it's much more interesting when you can show them a pair of Levi's from the 1880s that were worn by a cowboy, and explain how we know they were worn by a cowboy, from the spur tears at the cuff of the jeans to all the patching that's on the right side. We know this guy was right-handed. He had to be holding his reins in the right side. So we're able to tell a story from details in the jean. Sometimes it's a story that we put together from what we see on the jean. Other times we know who the people wore, who the people are that wore the items. And when you can share that, it just is much more, it's a better way to make a connection with folks. And I sometimes like to say that the archives is the closer on deals, because we often get people coming through that we are trying to connect with. We want to do a collaboration with. We want to do a partnership with, and we bring them in. We pull out a few things. We tell them the stories, and they go away and they're really excited. And I'll share one really cool example of this, because there's lots of these. But we had a guy. He's an up and coming designer, DJ, musician from New York. Young guy, and I brought him in and showed him the oldest pair of blue jeans in the world, which date to the 1870s. And as we often do, I took out a magnifying glass to show him some of the details. The innovation of blue jeans is the addition of rivets on pockets and some of the areas of the jeans. So I said, I want you to take a look at the rivets and look for some details on there. And we talked about the patent that Levi Strauss and the company took out in 1873. And here's this tiny little rivet. He's looking at it with a magnifying glass, and he can see the 1873 date in it. And he stops. So that's good. It's cool. He's excited, but this is what happens. So he looks at that date and he says, "You've got to be kidding." And then he's wearing a sweatshirt. So he starts taking off a sweatshirt. Which never happens. He starts taking off his sweatshirt, and then he pulls up the arm, and he says, "You've got to see this." Guess what he has on his arm? It's a tattoo. It says 1873. I'm not kidding, 1873. Underneath it says, "Mistakes are okay." So he tells me that his parents, on his birth certificate, they made a mistake, and they wrote 1873 is his birth date on there. Wow. And he's always seen it as, as his motto, mistakes are okay. He is never going to forget that story, because he has this personal connection. And in a very real way, we were able to do that. So, of course, guess who's working with us now? And I just saw him. He came in a few weeks ago, and we're working on a project together. And this time I pulled out pieces that he's going to use for inspiration for some designs he's working on for us.
Amazing. That's an incredible story. Yeah, that deserves a round of applause. I know. That you must have just gotten goosebumps when he pulls up the 1873. You're like, oh my God.
So I took a picture of it.
That's amazing.
Because, it's a pretty unusual way, but stories really become the emotional connection, the way to really link to people in a way that you can't do in any other way. Yeah.
No, it's great. And are you seeing, so clearly influencing design, influencing bringing in influencers and collaborators, how are other teams kind of tapping the archives and yourself and the stories that are in there to make progress and impact in their roles throughout the organization or throughout Levi's?
Mm-hmm. The Levi Strauss and Company archives really impacts virtually all parts of the business. We work with legal. We can help to find pieces that, they can use to defend the company in litigation. For instance, we have a lot of counterfeits all over the world, and to be able to demonstrate that we've been doing something from the very beginning allows us to very easily go into litigation and say, well, we have this 1870s pair of Levi's. So if you try to use this design on the back of your pockets, here's why you can't. It's protected because we were the first to do it. So legal, marketing is a huge one. I just met today with folks from our e-commerce team who are helping to tell stories online. So if you go onto Levi.com and you want to buy a pair of jeans or a jacket, you will sometimes see stories just below. They often come from the archives where they will give you context for things. For instance, we introduced a new t-shirt. It says button your fly. It comes from the idea of, button fly was the original blue jean. And in the 1990s, Spike Lee directed a series of commercials for Levi Strauss, and they were called Button Your Fly. And he went around asking people, hey, do you button your fly? And then they would get into what do you do when you're wearing your Levi's? We had Spike Lee in the archives. We talked about, and we brought out some of the original shirts. We talked about his directing it. And then we're able to use that story in some of our sales for the new tee. So we're not only affecting the business and developing relationships, but really in the bottom line, our sales, right? So we add stories right where people are buying, and it doesn't have to be a big long story. It can be a really short sound bite, but it gives them context for our products.
That's great. Those are incredible examples or stories.
Yeah.
What are some of the challenges that you think archivists and historians face at companies right now? Like, what are the things that you see either yourself or your peers kind of either struggle with within the organizations?
You always have to stay relevant. So it's thinking about what can I do to make sure that heritage is being incorporated in some way in the company. And I find myself, and I tell my team, we're usually a group that says, yes, yeah, we can do that. Sometimes we don't always know how, but we will, because we want to be an organization that people come to as a reference, come to build their stories, whether it's for marketing, for our direct e-commerce, whatever it is. But staying relevant is an important part of that. Being able to keep up with the fast pace of business and the technology that's part of it. So for us, when we moved into the 21st century, becoming a digital archives was huge. But staying ahead of that is going to be even greater, which was part of the reason why it was fun to work with a company like Inwoven that is willing to figure out together how we're going to do something. We've got an idea, how are we going to do it? I really like that, and I think it's part of what I like about that is that's what I'm always trying to do anyway as an archivist in a business, to remain relevant. I don't have the comfort of being tenured or the way that I am able to to stay and keep my job is to make sure that what we do is something that the company always finds of use.
That's great. And just what inspired the Tell Your Levi story? Was there a moment that you had that, because it was really fun to collaborate on that, and some of the stories there are really exceptional, and it'll just grow, right? But was there something that triggered, like, hey, we need a digital way, a way to make sure we have voice, we can pair it with photography, images, that type of thing?
The idea of Levi's stories, well, let me back up and say that most people that I talk to have some kind of connection to Levi's in some way. And I have found that there's all these stories out there. How do you capture them, and how do you make them accessible? Our museum was going to be redone. We have a lot of visitors that come into Levi Strauss & Company. Our museum's free. It's right by the cruise ship terminal, so you have a lot of people walking through. So the idea that we landed on was how do we use the museum where people can come in as a way to connect with them and capture some of the stories that we have. So the Tell Your Levi Story Station came out of that. We have also found that it's a way to take stories that we have. If I'm traveling and can meet with people, I can also record their stories and add them, so we're growing. So I mentioned that the professional bull riders were in today visiting the archives, and before they left, guess what? I said, Derek, one of the riders, let's go in. I got to capture your story. He had given us one of the shirts that he was wearing, our Levi shirt, when he was riding a bull, and it got torn up. So I had a picture of that shirt, and I had him tell me the story, and I uploaded it before I left. So it's now in the Tell Us Your Levi story.
That's awesome. So what are what are the things that keep you, I have two more questions and I'll open it up, but what are the things that keep you inspired in your daily life? Like, where are there certain things, authors, podcasts, things that you tap into to stay interesting and engaged? I mean, I'm sure the world of Levi's and all the things you're encountering keep you inspired in general, but are there outside sources that you tend to look for as well to inspire the way you think about the history and archives and telling the story of Levi's?
Yeah, there's all sorts of great podcasts, which I enjoy. I've been listening right now to TED Radio Hour a lot. They're
Nice.
they're really fun. I really like 99% Invisible. Some of the things that are on there. But I'll tell you something. So podcasts, naturally, I do a lot of reading, but I also have a performing group. I mentioned that my roots are with my family background from New Zealand and being Maori. So I have a Maori performing group. It's very different to my work, and it's also related. So what we do in perform, it's a dance group. It's folk ethnic dance, if you will, but when we perform a dance, it's storytelling in a very different way. So it's with actions, with music, singing, instruments, and we tell a story. So it naturally fits very well into my world in maybe an unexpected way at Levi Strauss. So being able to kind of connect with that, but think about it in another way, I find inspiration all the time in both.
That's amazing.
Both worlds.
And then just thinking about how you can express a story through dance versus, just a more typical way of voice or video. So, last question that I have before I open it up to the team. We oftentimes are working with folks who are just moving into the corporate archivist or historian or storyteller role. Is there any kind of tips or words of wisdom you'd want to share with them in helping them kind of navigate that new role in an organization?
Sure. I would say get as much experience in whatever way you can. Be open to doing all types of work. I have done probably just about any kind that you can think of, volunteer and paid. But I've taken small projects when I first started. I've worked for cities doing exhibits. I've done oral history projects. The idea is that if you can bring a variety of skills, I think you're going to be a much more successful archivist, historian in the work that you do. Because while I bring certain skills that come from my getting a master's, I think a lot of the skills that I bring also come from other work that I've done and just from life experience. And just having a rich background, I think, is going to serve most people well.
Great, thank you. I want to open it up to the team. Any questions that you guys have?
You mentioned you were like inspired when you were in grad school by another archivist. You're like, I want to do that.
Yeah.
Do you feel like you've like you've reached that level? That's kind of one, and then second, if so, then like, are there other peers that you have that you're like, oh, I still really admire you, or like, or do you feel like that tables have turned a little bit?
So the first question, back to I saw someone.
Hewlett Packard, right?
Yes. And remind me the question once more.
Like, do you feel like you're that?
Oh yes,
like,
right.
Feels like yes.
And you don't have to be too overly humble, like, you know.
The short answer is yes.
Uh-huh.
Because yes, I will tell you that not long after I graduated, I got an offer to go and work for them, and I turned it down. I was happy that I had the offer, but there were some other reasons I didn't do it. But it was an example to me that it really is good to have kind of something that you're looking at and can look toward. I still have people that I look up to in the field, and it doesn't even have to be within my own profession, but just people that I think that do interesting and good work. But definitely, it was helpful to see someone do it. And for me personally, as a woman, and when I was starting, she was a very confident and capable woman in business doing what I wanted to do. So that was part of what was inspiring for me, as a woman, doing that.
Definitely, I love that. It's great. Other questions?
What would you say, if you had to choose one piece that's in the archives, what piece do Levi's employees ask to see the most? Is there like one in particular that you're like, oh my god, 20-30% of the requests are for this like one piece, and I have to, go through it with them?
Yeah.
Can I add on to that question? So one piece that all the Levi's folks want to see, and the second one, if God forbid anything happened, but you had to take one piece with you, what would that might be a tough one to answer. But
Well, first, we have a fireproof safe.
Great.
And the most important things are kept in that safe. That includes the world's oldest blue jeans, which are probably the ones that I get the most requests for. They date to 1879, and because of the 1906 earthquake and fire, they're so rare that it's really great to have them. So I got a text today, actually, just before the Cowboys came in, and our CEO, Chip, had a group of visitors in, and could we host them? And could you pull out the oldest blue jeans? So they asked, could you pull out the oldest blue jeans? And then there was one more, because we have several. There were a couple. Oldest blue jeans, oldest women's blue jeans, and then third request was for a recent edition that we acquired in 2016. A very fabulous leather jacket worn by Albert Einstein, and it was produced by Levi Strauss & Company in the 1930s.
wow.
And that is an especially meaningful one to me, because I was in London in 2016. We were doing an exhibition with Victoria and Albert Museum on the 60s, and I happened to be in July. I took some pieces over there, and I got word that Christie's was having an auction and auctioning off this jacket. It was this leather jacket by Einstein. We did not know it existed. We had no idea that he wore the jacket. But he was photographed in it, and he wore it regularly. He's on the cover of Time magazine in 1938 wearing it.
My gosh.
So I went to the auction in person, and I had on the line with me the Levi's president. So we're I'm kind of explaining, if you've been into an auction, it's a giant room. There are people in person, people on the phone. There's a big phone bank on the one side, and then in the back of the room is a big screen. So people online are also bidding. So the auctioneer is saying, okay, number, you can hold up your paddle. I was 97. Number 97, or Brazil. they're the ones in the back, and all of this is going on. This was the week that Brexit was announced. I got the winning bid. I was so excited about, and that came back. It took us about 3 or 4 months for it to come in person, but that's probably been the second most requested item to come out.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, I got chills from this.
Did I show you guys the? Have you
No,
seen?
I want to see.
Well,
Yeah.
you'll have to see it because it's the one piece in our archives that we ask people to come and also take a sniff, take a whiff of. Oddly, because Einstein smoked a pipe, and you can still smell the scent of the pipe along with that leather smell. It's really fabulous.
It's a multi-sensory.
It
Yeah.
is multisensory.
Yeah.
So I've had supermodels. I've had several who come in, and they're just like, "Whoa!" I say that because they're no. We'll just leave it at that. They enjoyed it as well,
Yeah.
and so that's probably one of the second.
Well, it's interesting also that to think of like the archives, one being a reflection of history, but also what's happening at the present. And, I think clearly there's been different moments in, say, women's rights and women and taking the forefront and women in career and so forth. Do you feel like you're getting more requests right now to like the first women's jeans or to establish Levi's identity with women in this moment in time right now? And
Certainly this year.
this year.
And here's the great thing about 2018 for Levi Strauss & Company. This year marks the 100th anniversary of our creating our first women's garment. We called it Freedom Alls. And Freedom Alls were named because they gave women freedom. Freedom of movement. It's this kind of funny looking one-piece suit, kind of a harem balloon pant with a tunic over the top. And it was the perfect year to celebrate it. We had our first women's conference here in San Francisco. We held it at Fort Mason, and we took Freedom Alls from the archives to show employees. So we had it on display, and we also had our oldest women's blue jean. It's called Viola, named for the woman who wore it. Viola Longacre Bedford, who wore them. She grew up in Fresno, went to school at Fresno State University, wore them while she was a student at Fresno State and in the 30s. And so we had those two pieces on display, and talk about bringing relevance to a current conversation. We had Gloria Steinem speaking, and we had Viola and Freedom Alls in the back. So we had like the full circle of a conversation rooted in our past.
Incredible. That's
Yeah.
great. Any other questions?
Yeah, so I got to work really close with you on the Tell Your Story project.
We had fun.
I know that it's hopefully all the stories will come in, which will be great. And then second, if you could get some of those items in your archive, that's another great thing. But I was wondering if you had any type of vision that you thought like maybe it could be something really exciting to come out of the stories besides just the stories or the objects themselves.
I've got to figure out how to share them, and I'm always thinking about this, right? Because part of what I do is I go around. I'm very fortunate to be able to travel to different locations, and I plan to incorporate them in some way. The Tell Your Levi Story Station and the Woven platform that it's on now has given me this repository, so I can easily grab those stories and use them in a variety of ways. So I expect that I'll be doing a little bit more of that. But I'm always thinking about, remember, how do I keep history relevant? So I'm gonna be thinking about the next part of that. They'll definitely be used.
I can see Stephen in his mind. He's churning. He's churning. Well, I think like the series element at some point, as more stories come in and themes build, clustering them together so that you have like, so you almost can present them.
Well, I'll tell
That's
you what,
really
we're
interesting.
next year. So I'm anticipating next year. Next year we celebrate the 50th anniversary of bootcut and bell-bottom jeans.
Yes.
And it's all about customizing. This came out of people doing this who wanted to wear Levi's, but they wanted to wear them with boots. And we have a lot of bootcut and bell-bottom jeans. So I'm pulling those out. I want to get stories about those and being able to match them and pull them all together and then take them away. That's what I'm going to be focused on next year, doing those.
Exciting. What else? Great. Tracey, thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
being part of this. And you get a chance, this is part of our own history and culture, so we get to bring you in and welcome you. So.
And it just felt so homey right here.
The fireplace. Thank you again. This was great.
Absolutely.